Christmas was just around the corner, and the festive spirit seemed to permeate everywhere but my own life. The streets were alight with twinkling decorations, stores played cheery carols on repeat, and people hurried about with their holiday shopping. But for me, this year was different. Work had been slow, with the economy weighing heavily on everyone, and I found myself with an unusually long holiday break. Instead of spending it in the city, surrounded by crowds and expectations, I decided to do something I'd been planning for months, a solo camping trip deep in the Appalachian wilderness. The idea of celebrating Christmas alone in the serene stillness of nature felt like a much-needed escape. I wanted to leave behind the stress of the city and, more importantly, to capture the untamed beauty of the wilderness. My goal was to photograph scenes that few people had the chance to see. Frozen waterfalls, untouched snowfields, and the eerie quiet of winter in the mountains. This was an opportunity to add something unique to my portfolio. Images that would be as breathtaking as they were rare. The thought of snow-covered trees, icy streams, and starry winter nights filled me with a sense of quiet anticipation as I loaded my gear into the car and set off. The drive was uneventful at first. Snowflakes drifted lazily from the overcast sky, dusting the winding mountain roads. Holiday music played faintly on the radio, blending with the hum of the heater. As I ascended higher into the mountains, the roads became narrower, flanked by dense forest whose branches hung heavy with snow. The cheerful holiday atmosphere of the city was left far behind, replaced by an eerie, almost oppressive silence. The air grew colder with every mile, and the occasional flurry of snow began to obscure the road ahead. I tightened my grip on the wheel, focusing on the twists and turns of the desolate mountain path. The isolation was exactly what I wanted, but the creeping shadows of the forest made me feel small and vulnerable. I reached the remote trailhead just as the daylight was beginning to fade. The parking lot was empty, as I'd expected. Winter camping wasn't popular, and I welcomed the solitude. The air was frigid, and the faint crunch of snow beneath my boots was the only sound as I unloaded my gear. The shadows of the trees stretched long across the trail, and a light snow began to fall, blurring the world into shades of gray. By the time I reached my chosen campsite near a frozen creek, the sky was an impenetrable sheet of clouds, and the air was bitterly cold. I pitched my tent quickly, fumbling with stiff fingers, and gathered wood for a fire. The small blaze crackled to life, providing a comforting warmth against the chill. Sitting by the fire with a cup of hot coffee, I felt a sense of peace, despite the isolation. The forest seemed almost magical, its silence profound and untouched. For a moment I felt lucky to have escaped the city's chaos. This was exactly what I had hoped for. A tranquil Christmas in nature. That peace didn't last. As I ventured a short distance from camp to gather more firewood, the snow began to fall harder. The flakes grew larger and heavier, clinging to my jacket and turning the world into a swirling blur of white. The wind picked up, whistling through the trees, and the temperature seemed to drop even further. I stumbled upon something that made me pause. In a small clearing, partially hidden by the accumulating snow, was a strange arrangement of sticks and stones. They formed a deliberate pattern like a crude symbol or sigil. Nearby, a weathered animal skull was mounted on a stick, its empty eye sockets staring blankly at me. My breath hung in the icy air as a chill ran down my spine. Who had left this here? And why? I took a few photos, my curiosity mingling with unease. The arrangement looked ritualistic, but I told myself it was probably the work of some eccentric hunter or bored hiker. Still, the image of the skull stayed with me as I returned to camp. The once comforting silence of the woods now felt heavy, almost watchful. Every creak of the trees and distant rustle of branches set my nerves on edge. The falling snow muffled sound, adding an unnatural stillness that made the hairs on my neck stand on end. The storm intensified as night fell, the wind howling through the trees and rattling my tent. As I lay in my sleeping bag, the sounds began. At first they were faint, the snapping of branches, the rustle of underbrush. I tried to dismiss them as the movements of wildlife, but the noises grew louder and more deliberate. Slow, heavy footsteps began to circle my tent, their crunching rhythm unmistakable. My heart pounded as I sat up, clutching my flashlight. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. The footsteps stopped. Silence. For a moment I thought whoever it was had left, but then the footsteps resumed, closer this time. I unzipped the tent just enough to shine the flashlight outside. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees. Nothing. The footsteps stopped again. I waited, holding my breath, and then I saw it. A shadowy figure at the edge of the clearing, barely visible against the snow. It stood still, watching. My light flickered as I strained to make out details. The figure wore what looked like a wide-brimmed hat, its edges drooping unevenly, and its back was hunched, giving it an unnatural, twisted silhouette. Before I could react, it stepped back into the shadows and disappeared. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, clutching the camping knife I kept by my side. Every sound, every rustle of the wind made me jump. By morning, I found fresh tracks in the snow, confirming that I hadn't imagined it. The prints circled my tent before leading off into the woods. The tracks weren't animal prints, but deep, human-like impressions, as if someone had been pacing back and forth around my campsite. Determined to make sense of what I'd seen, I ventured back to the clearing with the strange symbols. To my horror, the sight had changed. The skull was gone, replaced by a pile of charred bones, and the symbols on the ground were joined by new ones, carved into the surrounding trees. The carvings were deep and jagged, their meanings indecipherable but menacing. I took more photos, my unease growing with every second I stayed there. The snow was falling harder now, and the wind carried an unnatural stillness that made the forest feel suffocating. As I made my way back to camp, the snowstorm worsened, whipping around me with relentless force. Visibility dropped to almost nothing, and I felt the overwhelming sensation of being watched. That night, the footsteps returned, louder this time, accompanied by a faint guttural whispering that seemed to come from all directions. My tent shook as something brushed against it, and I heard a loud crash outside. When I finally summoned the courage to look, I found my lantern lying in the snow, its glass shattered. The figure appeared again, closer than before. The hat and hunched back were unmistakable, but its face was obscured in shadow. I felt frozen, unable to move or speak, until the figure vanished once more into the trees. My mind raced with thoughts of escape, but the storm outside made it impossible to leave. By the third day, I knew I couldn't stay. The tension and fear were unbearable. I was no longer captivated by the beauty of the wilderness. All I wanted was to leave and never return. I packed up my gear in a hurry, my hands shaking, and set off toward higher ground in search of a cell signal. Every crack of a branch or gust of wind behind me sent a jolt of panic through my body. My legs felt heavy, but the adrenaline kept me moving. I didn't look back. When I finally connected to a signal, I searched for any information about the area. What I found chilled me to my core. 5 years ago, the area had been the site of a manhunt for a suspected serial killer, dubbed the Mountain Reaper. The killer was known for leaving ritualistic symbols at the scenes of his crimes and was last seen near a frozen creek. Authorities had never found him, and the case remained unsolved. The description of the suspect, a tall man with a hunched back and a wide-brimmed hat, matched the figure I'd seen. The victims had been hikers, campers, and even locals from nearby villages. Each crime scene was marked by the same strange symbols and mutilated animal remains, eerily similar to what I'd found in the clearing. Terrified, I returned to the clearing one last time to gather evidence, but everything was gone. The bones, the symbols, even the footprints in the snow had vanished, as if erased by the storm. I hiked out of the woods as fast as I could, the sense of being watched following me every step of the way. The drive back to the city felt agonizingly slow. My hands gripped the wheel tightly, and I checked the rearview mirror constantly, half expecting to see the shadowy figure lurking behind me. The snowstorm began to ease as I descended the mountains, but the tension in my chest didn't. Every mile closer to home brought a small measure of relief, but the fear lingered, gnawing at the edges of my mind. Back home, I reviewed the photos I'd taken during the trip. To my horror, The images of the symbols and the clearing were gone, replaced by static and corrupted files. Only one photo remained, a blurry shot of the shadowy figure standing among the trees, its hat unmistakable, its face hidden in darkness. The rest were innocuous shots of the landscape, as if the most terrifying parts of my experience had been scrubbed away. I stared at the photo for hours, the eerie silhouette burning into my memory. Now, as I sit in my apartment, staring at that photo, I can't shake the feeling that the figure is still out there, watching. Should I go to the police? Without the photos, who would believe me? And if they did, would it put me in danger? On quiet winter nights, when the wind howls outside my window, I swear I hear footsteps in the snow. What would you do? Let me know in the comments.